political historian, the mid-20th century. He says that because of this perspective, this transcendent perspective, and this otherworldly perspective, and a culture that begins to support that in their cultural myths, we have three characteristics that begin to show up. The three characteristics that begin to show up is an intense sense of an authoritarianism, of people telling other people how to be and how to live without choice. Somehow a manipulation of the population that they may believe that they are free when they are not free. We were talking in forum today about, do we still need unions? One person shared a story where in their history they were walking through the job site, they were not union, and they were joking, well, maybe we can get a union. And that was at lunch, and then they came back from lunch and went in, and the boss called them into the office and said, what's the problem here? You're talking about unions on the job. Okay. In that structure, there was a subject, a topic, a way of life you could not even talk about. But yet, it's a free society, but in this space, there are topics you can't talk about. If you can't talk about it, soon you will forget about it, soon you will not even know it exists, but it's a free society, but the thought's gone. Authoritarianism. The second is, there's a sense of destructiveness in the society. And I'm looking around at our world today and trying to assess whether there is a destructiveness or not. And I don't know if you've read, but there's a book that has come out recently that said our society is becoming less violent. And our world is becoming less violent. And they're giving statistics for this, and how many people used to die in homicides, and this is a well-known author, a professor at Harvard. And it's now even made its way into the newspaper. And I'm thinking, what? What? Not just wars. Maybe he's just thinking from a human perspective, and my guess is that's true, that he's thinking from an anthropocentric perspective. But no, you have to think larger than that in this world today. Because the world is not becoming less violent. We have 157 dead zones in this world, intensifying and growing in number. What's happening at the Gulf where the Mississippi River reaches it is going on all over the world. The world's not becoming less violent. The world's light is diminishing. There's a theologian and culture historian, Thomas Berry, says we're right in the middle of an era that began 65 million years ago, and you see cultural myths. Some people could not even entertain that thought because the world is not 65 million, it's over 6,000 years ago, so we can't even have this conversation with some people in our culture. But 65 million years ago, there was a period in our culture where life began to emerge and the diversity of life began to explode, and ultimately the human being came out of that era of time, and ultimately consciousness came out where we could reflect and enjoy this world. Looking out the window the other day and looking at the flowers of the loofahs and looking at the variety of bees that are on those flowers of the loofahs, and thinking about the details and the wonder of that, and at the same time thinking about a billion galaxies colliding and moving around, and just a wonder of the universe, and on the planet Earth, the diversity of life in that 6,000 million. He's saying that era is coming to an end. The Earth is no longer producing life the way it once was. That we are now moving into an era where we're going to hope we're going to be able to sustain life. That the diversity era and the growth is done. We're moving into another era, and the human beings are going to have some decisions to make about the planet, about how this new era is going to happen. So that was the authoritarianism, destructiveness of the world, and then he said there will be a sense of conformity in this type of society. I was reading an article by Jeffrey Sachs. Sorry, this article was called, I think, A Civilization of Idiots or something, I'm not sure. But he was talking about in the 1960s, 8% of the houses in our country had televisions. Now over 90% have televisions. And that if you want political power, you move to the television. You have to have money because that's a way to shape people's mind, to give you power and keep you in power. And that's a way to manipulate people so they think the same, and so forth and so forth. Conformity. when you have an earth-centered theology, you look at the planet and the voice of the planet, or the lack of the voice in the planet, which would be the sounds of the fish jumping and the birds feeding, or where woods used to be, and you hear animals and owls and stuff. I had this one friend who lived in the city, came out to the country, and he said, I can't stand it, there's too much noise, too much animal noise and violence out there, and I need horns and streets and cars and stuff. I mean, just craziness. But an earth-centered theology must engage in the dialogue of where the suffering is, not only of people, but also the planet. It must, or it's not, earth-centered theology. So the answer to today's, I think, deepest question, which we talked about 2 weeks ago, when we talked about theology, the existential question of today is, do we want to survive? We must answer that question. If we say nothing to that, or if we are passive to that, then we're not going to engage in earth-centered theology. If we say yes to that, then we must come up with some kind of way to think about that, some kind of way to understand that. And one way to do that is to think about the ethic of the other person, and now not only about the other person, but consider the trees, the forest, the oceans, the rivers, the lakes, the streams. They are also the other. They are no longer objects to be used or objects to be made to make profit from. They are now subject, not object. We are now in relationship with those aspects of the planet. We are not superior to use those aspects of the planet. It's a different perspective. So we must first consider the cultural dynamics that give us permission to objectify aspects of the planet and to use aspects of the planet for a profit that destroy the planet. We must engage in that dialogue and ask ourselves, do we want to continue in that direction or not? And let me be clear. There are people in power who want to continue in the direction to objectify and use the resources of this planet, full well knowing, that they are putting more toxics and more poisons on the planet. There are people in power making decisions about what we're going to do with the environment or not do in the environment, knowing that their decision is going to lead to the death of human beings, and they're still making that decisions, to me, without much struggle. That the value of a particular way of life has more value than the people that are going to be affected. Just read papers, read any of the papers. So not only do we have to consider how the culture teaches that, but we must move in with some strength in our own determination to say whether that's okay or not, and try to figure out a way of how to understand that. Thomas Berry, a theologian, and talking about the universe and the universe story, gives these three characteristics of the universe, which I think we could use as foundational values in earth-centered theology. He says that, first of all, the universe is a subject, and it is a subject that is in motion, and it's a subject that is moving, and it has self-organizing principles. When I first thought of that, I said, wait a minute, the universe has a self-organizing principle, that means it thinks. And he doesn't even go there. Maybe that's my human-centered model thinking that if it's self-organizing, it has to think. Maybe that's a human-centered. So now I've got to wrestle with that. Does my own human-centered self-thinking cloud the way I can think about a new way of being in this world? But it must be self-organized, because we're here. The universe had to organize itself in a particular way for us to be here to draw breath. The universe had to organize itself in a particular way for this planet to be circling this sun in a particular way for it to be here. The universe had to organize itself in a particular way for there to be liquid in the middle of our planet, the crust on the external of the planet. Very unusual for planets to have that combination, but the universe organized itself in such a way that it exists. The universe organized itself in such a way that dirt was here, and that life came here, and that humans came here. So maybe indeed the universe is a self-organizing process, which makes it subject. Number two, he said the universe is in communion. Now, with the Christian history and understanding how they mean communion and interacting with the Last Supper and those things, I'm already confused. What do you mean communion? He said communion means that everything is in relationship. That the rainforest, the coral reefs, the Everglades, the oceans, the trees, our breath, our need for water, we are all in relationship, and there is a communion that's going on. And then he says there is a great diversity in the universe. Somehow this great organization process creates this great diversity. So now I have a model. I've got Erich Fromm's characteristics of a human-centered theologies, religious, spiritual practices, economic practices, social practices, cultural practices. Right? He's got three principles there. Thomas Berry's got three principles of the universe here. So I can put in dialogue the subjectivity, the subject nature of the universe with this human practice of being authoritarian. I can put that in dialogue and try to make sense out of that. I can take the sense of communion and relationship and put it in dialogue with the destructiveness. I can take the differentiation, the diversity, and put it in dialogue with the movement to conformity. I have a way to talk about it. I have a way to put this functioning, self-organizing universe in dialogue with the culture in which I live. And that's the beginning of developing a healthy theology, is you take principles and put them in dialogue with the characteristics of our culture. We are called to watch and pray, to act so that we don't fall into the temptation of what Erich Fromm describes, that is injuring and hurting us as a people and as a planet. Not to have a spirit that is willing and a body that is weak, not to have action. We are in dire times. But now is the time for us to have fire in our bellies and steel in our spines and to be of resolute in mind. But has that not been true for Unitarian Universalists since we've begun? We've been persecuted for our beliefs. We've been persecuted for pushing freedom of mind and freedom of consciousness. We've been scapegoated in our stance against wars, World War I, World War II, and the wars of the recent history. We've been persecuted for our support